it's not yes or no. It's not we either fix climate change or the worst things happen. Every ton of carbon dioxide that we can stop will make the world just a little bit better.
Welcome to the We Need to Act, the podcast about the people, ideas, and movements shaping a better now. I'm Sara, your host, an academic and sustainability professional who believes that understanding the world is the first step to changing it. Each episode, I sit down with extraordinary guests from around the world, scientists, activists, indigenous leaders, entrepreneurs, and thinkers who are doing the work and leaving the change. My guest today is Daniel Farber, the Sato Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley, where he leads two research centers focused on law, energy, environment, and democracy. A former law clerk to Justice John Paul Stevens of the U.S. Supreme Court, he is the author of several influential books, including Eco-Pragmatism and Contested Ground: How to Understand the Limits on Presidential Power. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and one of the leading voices in environmental and constitutional law in the United States. Thank you, Daniel, for joining us today on the We Need to Act podcast. It is a great honor to have you with us.
It's great to be here.
Thank you so much. And to start with the basics, because this is an educational podcast focused on sustainability, for listeners who may not be familiar with environmental law, what is it and why is it so essential in addressing the environmental crisis we face today?
Well, environmental law is really a whole collection of different laws that deal with air pollution, water pollution, endangered species, toxic chemicals, and so forth. And they're the rules of the road that govern what companies can do, what kinds of pollution we might allow, at what levels, how do we clean things up, et cetera. And it's crucial because despite the fact that some companies have good intentions, the reality is that they're not going to change their act all by themselves. And what they need is a directive from the government, and that takes the form of environmental law.
Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, that's true. Coercive power is much more efficient.
Yeah.
Regarding environment. And you have argued that traditional regulatory approach, such as simply limiting emissions, may not be sufficient and that we should shift towards investment-led policies. Could you explain what you mean by that and why do you think this approach could be more effective?
Sure. I want to be clear. I'm not arguing that we should completely abandon the traditional regulatory approaches. I think in some areas they're definitely the way to go. And in other areas, they're probably still going to be necessary as part of the whole package. But when looking at climate change, we really have a two-part problem. One is we need to cut down and eliminate ultimately carbon emissions. But in order to do that, we have to build a whole new energy system, which we've already started doing. But we need to have renewables, geothermal, et cetera, as power sources. We need a lot of battery supply. We need a much better transmission system. We need electric vehicles. It goes on. And those things are not just going to happen on their own. We have to be thoughtful about how we're going to build out all of that technology and how we're going to make it all work together, right? Because you have to have the right kinds of generation and grid in order to, convert to millions and millions of electric vehicles, in order to electrify things like making steel, et cetera. And so that's an equally big problem along with phasing out the emissions. And that's why I think that we need to move, at least to some extent, beyond the idea of just limiting emissions. And we need to think about what we're going to build in place of the fossil fuel world.
Having a more holistic approach.
Yes, exactly.
Systemic approach to the problem.
Yeah. And I think they go hand in hand because as we improve electric vehicles and their availability and charging and all of that stuff, I think it's an inherently better technology, and that will help push out the use of gas and diesel. because, those are technologies people invented in the 19th century. And, we don't need to have our world operate that way.
True. And well, some countries like China, they are speeding up their
Yes, exactly. And I'm concerned about that. I'm glad somebody's doing it. I would
uh,
much rather that we were doing it rather than China.
well, you are fighting for something else,
Right.
resource nonetheless.
Yes.
Yeah, but do you think, well, the state of the world as it is right now, what do you think will be the future? Because we see some slowing down, even in terms of policies. I'm in Europe, and we see that too here. And what do you envision?
Yeah, I'm, I guess, basically optimistic. I'm concerned about what's happening here. Obviously, have hit a very bad patch in terms of being able to make progress for political reasons. But I think if you look beyond the US, the picture is much different, where you're continuing to see a lot of expansion of electric vehicles, of huge build outs of solar and wind power, et cetera, et cetera. A lot of that, as you mentioned before, is driven by China, which has really found ways to bring down the cost and to improve performance to some extent of these technologies. And I think, as bad as it is in other ways, our current war with Iran, I think it's pretty clear that it's accelerating the energy transition in other parts of the world. Other countries have realized that as long as they depend on fossil fuels, they're at the mercy of international markets and geopolitics. And I saw, for example, that the sale of Chinese EVs went up about 50% in a month after the war began, as people realized that they just need to declare energy independence. And if you're not, a country that has tons of oil and natural gas and coal in the ground, the only way to do that is to take advantage of what you do have, which is sun and wind. So I think that's going to accelerate the trends. I worry about whether we'll catch up and,
It's not too
whether,
late.
yes, but I'm hopeful that, with the right leadership and with improving technologies, that we can get back in the game.
That's really important. And as you mentioned, at least here in Portugal, the current conflict war in Iran, it increased the sales of EV
Oh,
a
great.
lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is good. We
Yeah.
have solar and the wind, so we are investing in solar and wind energy, but we don't have fossil fuel.
Yes, no, and you're not alone. And even some countries, say in Asia, that might have, some fossil fuel, it's really not enough. And if they have coal, maybe they don't have oil and gas, and they're still looking for ways. They've been hit very hard by this crisis because of the tremendous increase in prices, and they don't want to go through that again. So I think this has been a good lesson, really, on why reliance on fossil fuels ultimately is just not a smart economic move.
Right. And circling back to what you were saying about we need good leadership to to take us out of this crisis, and how can it be changed?
Yeah, I think it's really unfortunate that environmental issues and climate change have become so politically polarized because they shouldn't be. They're issues that affect everybody. And the facts are the facts, right? You can feel about them any way you want to, but the reality is that climate change is happening rapidly, that it's already caused serious harms, and that it's just going to get much worse unless we take action. What you think about a bunch of other political issues shouldn't really be relevant. You should be looking at this one by itself. And it hasn't always been this polarized. That's another thing. A lot of younger people today, they've never lived in a world that was different politically, but environmental law used to be much more of a consensus issue. And even in the Reagan years, there was bipartisan support for things like looking at climate change and trying to figure out what to do. It's only been really, say, since maybe 2008 here with Obama, I think, that we've really seen polarization accelerating on these issues to the point now where it's hard to talk to people on the other side of the political spectrum. But I'm hoping we can get past that.
Well, me too, because this is not like something left or right wing. This is
Absolutely.
common good where we are fighting for our own survival and the well-being of everyone.
Yes, absolutely. So, I think polarization's a reality. We can't ignore it. But I think we can also start thinking about how to get past it or how to moderate it at least a bit and looking for areas where people who have very different political views might still be able to agree on certain things. One environmental area where we're seeing that right now in the US is about toxic chemicals, where just in the last few months, we've had this very interesting alliance between what's called MAHA, which is Make America Healthy Again, um, and, those are people who are typically very right wing, but very concerned about health and very concerned about chemicals. And so we've seen them really starting to work hand in hand with environmentalists who've been worried about toxic chemicals for a very long time to try to make a difference. And I think those partnerships are really important, partly because they build trust, right? And they show that the people you think of as the enemy and as, I don't know, evil and so on. No, they have different views, but, they're still people. They're still your fellow citizens, and that it actually is possible to have conversations and work constructively together. And I think that's a really important lesson. We shouldn't need to be taught that, but I think right now we do.
Yeah, that's right. And that's also a communication issue. And my area is sustainability communication and something that you're doing, how we talk and how we approach this
Right,
stuff.
that's totally critical, right? We do have to find ways to talk to each other.
That's right. And you mentioned about this polarization, and it is also been exacerbated by misinformation and the use of AI, which is spreading lies.
Yes, misinformation's a real problem. AI so far has not been helpful. Maybe there are ways of making AI part of the solution instead of part of the problem. I don't know. But, we have a lot of challenges.
That's true. And we talked about the political situation, especially in the US. And do you expect states and local governments to fill the gap if federal action is limited? Because you are in a very active state, I would say, California.
I do think really the only really durable climate action we've really seen in the US has been from state governments and local governments to some extent. The federal government goes forward, but then it goes backwards because of the national politics. But many states have maintained very steady support for sustainability, for the energy transition, and for climate action. And that's gone on for years now. And they can't fill the gap entirely. They don't have unlimited powers and they, are limited by state lines, by geography, right? So they can't fix the whole country. But they do account for a lot of the US population and a lot of the US economy. I mean, California by itself is, I don't know, over 15% of population and the economy. Right, and there are a bunch of other states that are also active. So that's actually been one sort of ray of hope. In addition, those jurisdictions are pioneering techniques and legal methods, types of regulation, spending programs that the federal government can ultimately adopt, right? In a way, we've been doing the sort of lab work for the federal government when the federal government finally gets on board. So yeah, I do see that as a very positive thing. It's not unique to the U.S. That there are other countries where state or provincial governments have been ahead of the national government. Tokyo adopted a kind of cap and trade scheme years before the Japanese national government took any real action. Just as an example from another country. But I think in the U.S. has been especially important just because the federal government has just not been reliable.
True. Probably we need a more bottom-up approach.
Yeah,
focus
Right.
more on localization and
Yes.
localized actions. So, and going back now to, or talking about a different topic, which is not that different. We know that climate change is fundamentally unfair and with vulnerable communities disproportionately affected. And well, law should encompass everyone. And you have written about environmental justice in this context, and this is really important and is a really relevant topic. What role does environmental law play in addressing these inequalities? And do you think environmental justice is realistically achievable?
Well, I don't think it's ever going to be fully achieved, but I think we can make progress. And I think there has been a real effort, I think, especially under the Biden administration, to start addressing environmental justice concerns. We've obviously taken a big step backwards. I think it's important to say, I mean, in the US, we tend to think of environmental justice in terms of race, but that's certainly an important dimension. But rural communities can also have, white communities can also have poverty and unfair exposure to environmental harms. In terms of climate change, climate change will hurt everybody, but it will hurt some people a lot more than others. And often those people who are already vulnerable. And I think that we can do a lot more. We need to devote more attention to the inequalities in who is exposed to risks. And we also have to consider the fact that even if, say, the same level of pollution is present in two communities, one of those communities might be a lot more vulnerable. People might already have more health problems. They might already be exposed to more kinds of pollution. They may not, at least in the US, have the same quality of access to medical care. And so we have to consider both the inequality in exposure and the inequality in vulnerability. That's not impossible to do, right? And I think we've seen some not good examples in which the government has tried to take that approach. It would be helpful if Congress would write more of that into law instead of really leaving it to the agencies like our EPA to try to come to grips to the problem. But like most things, it's going to become a bigger problem with climate change just because threats are going to become bigger, right? And
Yeah.
those threats are going to be unequal. Poor people may be more likely to be located, for example, in areas that are subject to flooding. Often in the US, the wealthy people live on higher ground, and the poor people might live on, low-lying land that used to be a
Yes.
swamp, which
Okay.
means that it used to get flooded, and it
Yeah.
can get flooded
Very.
again. Yeah.
So yeah, that's really important to notice. And how can we address these risks? Are people aware in general, do you think, in the US about these issues that they have been impacted with?
Do you mean the inequality issue?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of climate change and what is happening, and that they have been more impacted by, do you think people are aware?
I think that's very mixed. I think it's not always clear to people that when something bad has happened, that it's related to climate change. So they may just not make that connection. I mean, it's very interesting, though, that even the Trump administration, although they don't admit to knowing about climate change, but they talk about problems like the permafrost in Alaska is melting and is going to continue to melt. Well, the reason for that is climate change. They don't say that, but they do talk about the problem. They can't really avoid it. Right. And if you live in southern Florida, whether or not you are thinking about climate change, it's obvious that there is a bigger flooding issue than there ever used to be in the past. So people are starting to, become more aware, but they don't always connect it with climate change. And if changes happen gradually, sometimes, we don't really realize that it's happening at all. It's just, you kind of lose your anchor in what it used to be like. And you just get used to more days, like in Florida, where there's no storm, but if the tide is high, streets may flood. So that used to be something that almost never happened. Now it's happening a lot more frequently. I don't know whether people connect that with even realize that it's changed because it didn't change overnight, right? It just sort of gradually got worse. Sometimes we just become accustomed to things. But that's a job for you as a sustainability communications person.
That's true. to to make people aware of what is happening, and to what is especially challenging is to how to connect with them emotionally so that
Hmm.
they can be linked to the problem in order to act, because there is this gap between attitude and behavior. And normally people tend not to change behaviors unless there is something for them.
Yes,
What's in it
right.
for me? How we
Yes. And it's hard to change their views, I think, unless they feel there's something they can do. It's much easier if you tell them, well, this bad thing is going to happen and there's nothing you can do. That's something people will resist. If you tell them this bad thing is happening, but you can help with the solution, I think that's maybe much more, acceptable to people.
Yeah, giving them a sense of agency.
Hmm. Yes.
And I have like another question regarding, we are talking about behavioral change now, but then going back to coercive measures and the power of environmental law. How do you see the relationship between democracy and environmental policy?
Yeah. I think it's an important question. I think sometimes people look at China, say, and they say China's doing all this great stuff. They don't have a democracy. It's too bad we have a democracy.
In the other
But
anything.
I think that that's a mistake. Like, it's true that China is doing some really constructive things on climate change, but they're not really doing them, I think, because the government cares about climate change. They're doing them because of economic policies. They're doing them because they want to reduce air pollution in cities because that leads to public protests. But the president of China could get up one morning and say, no, now I feel like using coal is more Chinese. We're all going to use more coal. And that would happen, right? You're really at the mercy of one person. And I think in democratic countries, it may be harder to move because you have to persuade a lot of people, not just one guy. But once you do have that kind of public attitude and opinion favoring solutions, I think they're likely to be more fair and more durable, because what the dictator can give with one wave of his hand, he can take away with another wave of his hand. In a democracy, if you persuade the public of something, it's going to be very hard to undo.
That's right. And how can people, well, citizens, push forward for more environmental policies?
I think it's hard to give a one size fits all answer because people are in different situations, right? They have different skills, they have different financial resources, they have different needs, and in terms of resources, I really don't just mean money, networks of people they relate to, maybe how well they behave in certain kinds of social situations, how good they are at communicating. So I think there are a lot of different things, and that you have to and for some people, the key thing may be changing like their behavior as a consumer, right?
Vote with their wallet.
Yeah, through their wallet. Right. Yeah, exactly. Through their wallet. Get solar on their roof or get an electric vehicle or stop buying products, from companies that use a lot of fossil fuels, lots of different things. Other people can reach out into their communities and try to communicate with friends, try to work jointly. I think there are a lot of things people can do as citizens that don't require that you be an important influential person. Legislators, especially at the state level, are very responsive to what they hear from their constituents. And, if you just start writing letters to people telling them, what you think of what they're doing and what they should do differently in order to work towards sustainability, that can make a difference too. I think it's a mistake to think that just because, say, you're in a community or a state that's very conservative, that you can't do anything. There are some great stories about people, like some high school students in Utah who took on a project of trying to get the state government to do something about climate change. And these were very, sort of standard American students. They weren't wild radicals or anything like that. But they organized, they decided what they wanted to communicate. They made group visits to the state legislature to talk to people, and it actually made a difference. So Utah, which is in some ways one of the most conservative US states, a very high Mormon population and so on, but they adopted a climate plan. That happened because these kids were willing to put their time and energy and brains into trying to make something happen. So I think the most important thing is to remember individually we're powerless. Nobody can fix climate change on their own, not even the most powerful people in the world. But collectively, we're very powerful. And what we need to do is, I think, look around you, figure out what you can bring to the table, and start acting.
It's really important what you just highlighted, especially the part of the community, this sense of belonging to something greater. And I often talk to people and they say that sometimes they feel alone in the fight, but when they find a community, they kind of get empowered.
I think that's really crucial. I think we see that a lot. And that's one reason something like demonstrations, they may not be effective. They might be effective. They may not be effective in persuading others or in getting the government to change. But one of the things that they're always good for is seeing that you're not alone, right? And that there are other people with you. And that's very important just all by itself.
Getting out in the streets.
That's not necessarily in a big dramatic way, but, just having some opportunity to see that you're not alone, you are part of a community. That's so important because when people feel that they're alone, they feel powerless, and then they don't try to do anything.
That's true. And we live in a very lonely society.
We do, and I think it's unfortunately getting worse due to
It is.
technology.
That's true. And people feel like they're ever more depressed nowadays. And
Right.
we need to go back to the community to find that belonging again. Well, this has been a really interesting conversation. And do you have any final message you would like to leave with our listeners who are concerned about climate change, but unsure?
I think one thing to remember is it's not yes or no. It's not we either fix climate change or the worst things happen. Every ton of carbon dioxide that we can stop will make the world just a little bit better, right? So you don't have to set yourself this impossible standard of, unless we stop all carbon emissions in the next 2 years, we might as well give up. It's not true. Even if things get very bad, it will still be true that we have the power to stop them from getting worse.
That's so true. Thank you so much for that reminder. It was really a great pleasure to have you with us.
It was fun. Thank you.